Welcome to the Dissecting the Wisdom of Shaltazar episodes. My name is Jeffrey Eisen. I'm a spiritual life coach, the channeler of Shaltazar, and an energy intuitive. In these episodes, my collaborator and friend Mark Lane and I will be picking a particular message in each episode that we will be reviewing, having a conversation about, and dissecting the wisdom from. The messages from Shaltazar are very high-level master teachings, and it is key to peel them away, dissect them, comment on them, and discuss them in order to get the greatest value. We hope you'll be intrigued, we're confident you'll learn, and we know you will benefit. And welcome again to Dissecting the Wisdom of Shaltazar. My name is Jeffrey Eisen, and my good friend and collaborator, Mark Lane, is here with me today. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Jeffrey. How are you?
Excellent. Today's message you chose for us to dissect and talk about.
Separation or unity? The choice is yours.
Interesting. Yeah, we've heard that unity phrase, that unity idea a lot from Shaltazar and even in our previous podcast. What drew you to this particular message?
It seemed like a natural extension. Perhaps the last few podcasts, we kind of started out with oneness, talked about, the now, creating the now. And then this past, we talked about kind of that idea of the collective unconscious and, how we all share a base level of awareness, every other being on the planet. And I guess as that sort of dovetails into the current adversity that we're seeing in the news, regard to race and equality, this message sort of speaks directly to that topic. The idea that are we as a civilization wanting to move more toward separateness or more toward unity? And that's kind of where it caught my eye, I guess.
Yeah, it is very timely. I'm fascinated by the energy of the planet that is causing this discussion on a deeper level. We certainly have had, racism and discrimination around for hundreds of years, but I don't know about you, but it feels a little bit different. It feels different, and I don't know whether it'll fizzle out, but part of our conversation today hopefully is going to fuel that discussion in a way that promotes more unity. Mm-hmm. What hit you most about this message? What stood out for you in this one?
I think what did I underline here? What I had just mentioned, will you choose to move to more fear, more separation, or will you choose to move to more love, to more unity? It's kind of like Shaltazar is telling us we have, only two choices. We either, choose separateness and probably disintegrate as a civilization or move at least into a much darker place, or we choose unity and we start to kind of climb out of the darkness into the light and see where that leads us, ostensibly into something fabulous and wonderful where we don't see this divisiveness that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Once again, as usual, when you and I highlight, there tends to be a great similarity, which I guess is a unity, right? I mean, right. There's an example, and before we got on this discussion, you and I were talking about how our relationship has evolved from separation to unity. We were two separate people. We met on Insight Timer, we chatted, and then all of a sudden we started to do some collaborative projects. We started to do some writing. Now we're doing, we did the promoting pandemic positivity. Now we're doing this. It's sort of like you can feel us coming together. Mm-hmm. And, one of the things that really struck me in this message is how they're talking about separation and unity is a feeling, and it's not a mental construct. And if you look at just our relationship, the feeling of closeness, the feeling of you and I working together, the feeling of collaboration is much different than that separation feeling when we first began. There's that coming close together. So, to me, I think that's interesting, but I want to go back to that fear or separation, love or unity. And it was interesting because I listened to that and reread it a few times. It's interesting that fear goes with separation based on this channeling, and love goes with unity. It wasn't this long list of stuff. And we are seeing that in the world today. We are seeing a lot of fear that seems to be perpetrating separation, and we are seeing a coming together. We're seeing compassion. We're seeing empathy. We're seeing love, and that seems to be bringing us close together. And I'm finding those polarities are much more intense today, Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. But the intensity does have a different feel to it, I guess. I mean, socially, at least in this country, racism has been an issue for as long as I've been around. So I was born in 1961, and that was kind of the peak of, the first awakening, we'll call it, I guess, when people started to become conscious of each other. The Vietnam War was raging. The conversation around racism at that time seemed there's a lot more anger to it, I think, a lot more, I guess, even it seems to me that I could be wrong, but it seems to me that the folks that were proponents of ending racism their approach was even more divisive than the racism itself. It was, they drew a line and said, okay, you're over here, we're over here, and we're only really interested in supporting us over here, and you're only interested in supporting you over there. This seems to be like those lines have blurred a bit, and the wall in between the races seems to be maybe shorter, and people are kind of crossing over from one to the other, and there's more of a blending of the energies, I guess, if I could describe it as that.
Yeah, no, I would agree. That's very interesting. I have a client who is a white person who just feels so close to the black issue, the Black Lives Matter, and she doesn't, she's not sure, maybe in a past life she was, a black person, a black slave, I don't know. But it's interesting to see that. And we started to see a little bit of that in the Me Too movement, in the women's movement, where men were standing up and supporting women. It wasn't just women. So I think what we're describing is a little bit more of that unity. And that divisiveness you talked about is really a big one. I do see one camp in the world that is trying to bring us together, and I see another camp that is trying to drive us apart, to focus on what's different about it, about us. Let me ask you the question, how do you think the world would look? What do you think we can do to make the world more unified? What are some of the practical things? It's easy for you and I to sit here and talk about this, but what are the things that as individuals we can do to promote unity?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that this message, as you pointed out, Shaltazar talks about, the feeling consciousness. And I think that what that means is when we talked about this a little bit in one of the other podcasts, but what that means is when you look into another person's eyes, that light that you see is the same light that's in your own eyes. It's the same light that you see in every other set of eyes that you look into. The shell or the container that we're in is really irrelevant. Black, white, tall, thin, young, old, those external labels or those external, tags that we put on each other are really irrelevant. And I think that this awakening is, part of this awakening is we're starting to see people who are becoming awakened, starting to notice that the irrelevance of a lot of the physical world that's surrounding us. And so kind of what to me that means we're starting to kind of shut off our minds a little bit. We're starting to tune into our hearts a little bit more, and we're starting to feel that connection to each other rather than trying to look at it and examine it based on what we see. We're starting to use our heart and our feelings more than our eyes.
Yeah, that's interesting. A bunch of things pop up. You could have a collaborative team at work. A lot of companies are moving more towards team approach, collaborative teams. And in one company, you can have a collaborative team and they really are not cohesive. They really don't sort of resonate. They really don't feel that they are working together. You could have another team in the same company or another team in a company that's similar, and yet that team has a resonance, that team has a mutual respect. And so that goes back to what Shaltazar is saying, is that the unity is a feeling. It's not the structure of a work team that determines unity. It is the feeling of how that team works together. Another thing that popped up in my mind as you were talking is I think it requires a major paradigm shift. There's no doubt on the planet of free choice and the planet of the duality, there are things that are the same about us, and there are lots of things that are different. And it reminds me of that old piece of Cherokee wisdom where the grandfather would say to the grandson, there's two wolves that live inside of each of us. And he would describe the two wolves, one as being good and kind and compassionate and loving, and then the other wolf is evil and egotistical and fearful, etc., etc. And and the grandson looks at the grandfather and says, which wolf wins? And the grandfather simply says, whichever wolf you feed. Mm-hmm. And so are we feeding unity or are we feeding separation? Are we feeding that which makes us different from each other, or are we feeding that which makes us the same? And I think that's sort of what Shaltazar is saying, is that we have to make a conscious choice. If we want, we can always find things that are different, right? Mm-hmm. You're in Chicago, I'm Toronto. You're an American citizen, I'm a Canadian citizen. You're this, I'm that, right? And then we can get into religious differences. And, yes, we have the same color skin, but maybe you didn't. And so the question is, when we look at another human being, do we automatically start looking at the differences, or do we start seeing, as you say, the light of their soul? That's going to be a big paradigm shift. I think that's going to be the way we're going to come together, is by focusing on the wolf of unity, not on the wolf of separation. And we need to feed that. We need to feed it to our kids. We need to feed it to ourselves. We need to feed it to our neighbors. We need to start thinking in terms of what joins us together, what makes us together, as opposed to what makes us apart.
Right, that's true.
There's a line in here that, I underlined and starred, but this one I actually highlighted. It is trying to explain a little bit more about what separation is. And it says, we've explained to you before, not only separation, but unity. We've explained to you before how fear is separateness, greed is separateness, doubt is separateness, the mind is separateness, the ego is separateness, judgment is separateness, destructive criticism is separateness, and blame is separateness. And then they go on to say, and we have also explained how faith is oneness, feeling is oneness, courage is oneness, love is oneness, empathy is oneness, acceptance is oneness, and understanding is oneness. And so, to me, maybe we need to just try to focus on more of those things that are oneness. And so if a situation comes up and, your automatic response is judgment, well, maybe you want to go to understanding, or maybe you want to go to, to empathy. So just something to consider.
That sort of reminds me of that Abraham advice, reach for a better feeling thought. Maybe it's reach for a better feeling emotion, because, I think when you're feeling that you want to blame somebody, or you want to criticize somebody, or you want to judge somebody, that doesn't feel good inside, right? I mean, it feels angry, or it feels aggressive, or it feels critical. It's not a good feeling. Whereas, some of those other, acceptance or love or courage, those do feel good. So maybe it's a matter of catching yourself if you start to feel one of those negative perceptions and turn it around into something more positive.
Yeah, that awareness, that consciousness. And Shaltazar talks a lot about us being in the period of time where it's time, there's a wake-up call out there, and we have to look at becoming certainly more conscious. One of the things I was also thinking about is, within myself, there are times that I want to pull back, and that tends to be more of a male trait. I know the feminine energy, my wife loves to talk to her girlfriends and connect, and that raises her energy. And that's interesting, because I guess what just hit me now is that maybe the more natural feminine energy is a unity, and more of the masculine energy tends to be a separation, because often I like to go into my man cave. It's my sanctuary, but it's the same thing. I like to retreat back within. I like to pull back. And so understanding that we are both, and I think it's how you handle the separateness. For me, when I am feeling, a little bit lonely or not fitting in, I try to go within and rebalance myself, and I try not to take it out on the people around me. And I think sometimes that's a source of a lot of our problem, is when we're feeling separate, we are feeling out of alignment, we are feeling out of harmony, and then we lash out instead of rebalancing our inner being. Because I think our inner being will always, because we live in the planet of the duality, in the place of polarity, we will always feel a little bit of that separation. And if we're lucky, we're going to feel a lot more of that unity or oneness. But realizing that when you have that separation, you're going to feel grumpy. Often, when the observer in me knows I'm grumpy and I'm starting to yell at my wife, I say, by the way, I just want you to know I'm really grumpy, so I'm sorry I'm doing this. I probably will continue to argue with you, but please forgive me, because I'm coming from this place of grumpiness. Mm-hmm. And to a certain degree, I'm admitting my separateness, but also apologizing and coming from a little bit of a place of oneness. oneness to let her know, not to take it personally. So we do have to find ways of working through our own individual separateness, because we do go through those polarities. It could be the weather, it could be the job, it could be all kinds of things that causes us to withdraw and go within and become separate. And that's okay, provided you handle it in a mature way. And I think that there would be far less conflict in the world if everybody kind of owned their own separateness and didn't dump it on the world. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we've talked about cycles of the moon affecting, the energy around you and how you feel. So, and maybe the ability to be a bit introspective and to understand, to tune into your feelings, understand how you're feeling, perhaps meditate or think, where that feeling is coming from. And, rather than lashing out and taking it out on somebody else around you, just own it and live with it and, wait for the cloud to blow past.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because Shaltazar in many messages talks about, loving all of us. And Shaltazar makes it quite clear that we are the light and we are the dark. And I don't think they're expecting us not to have the greed and the doubt and the fear and the ego. I think what they're saying is try to love that part of it so that you can then move more to the unity. I think a lot of people are stuck in the separateness. I think the whole racist movement or any discrimination is you're kind of stuck in your separateness and you don't allow it to move through you. You don't look at the deeper underlying issue of the fact that maybe someone has suppressed you and so therefore you feel you must suppress others. Well, if you could process your own feeling of suppression, and I don't know about you, similar vintage. I was born in 52, so I got a few years on you. I was approaching teenagehood in the 60s when you were just wandering around in diapers. But, we went through a school system, we went through, parental guidance where there was a suppression, where there was a repression, where you were taught that you can't do this or you have to do this. And so we need to acknowledge that those life experiences are part of who we are. The key is, and I'm going back to promoting that again, if we can work through that ourselves, then we're not going to take it out on someone else. And I think that's the key. All right. And as I said, I do take it out on my wife every once in a while, but at least I apologize. And maybe someday I'll find a better way so I don't have to take it out on her. I'll be able to process that in such a way that it doesn't affect her. So learning to love, and Shaltazar says that you don't have to like it, but learning to love that lower and slower, learning to love those parts of you that are separateness. In this message, they say that separation is part of the game of human life, that the source separated us from the oneness for purpose. So we can't deny the fact that we have this separateness. We just have to learn to cope better with it. I think that's the answer. I think, as well as trying and aspiring to unity more of the time, that's great. The other half of it is going to be we need to learn that part of us that is separate, learn to love that darkness, learn to love those things so that they don't come out in inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can have separateness, but not have it be destructive.
Yeah, right. So in other words, I can be separate from someone that doesn't look like me or have the same religion or the same culture, but I don't have to hate that other person. I don't have to dislike that other person. I don't have to disrespect that other person, because if I feel good enough about me, then there's lots of room for that diversity, isn't there?
True.
Reminds me of another message. I forget exactly what it's called, but it does talk about honoring the diversity of the world. And so, maybe that's something that we will talk about in the coming weeks. But this one's really, I find interesting because they make it so simple, but of course it's complicated. It's not as simple as separation or unity. And all of their messages are meant to be delved into, which is why I love doing this series with you, Dissecting the Wisdom of Shaltazar. They want to distill it to the simplicity of separation or unity. The choice is yours. But as you and I have just started to peel back the onion, there's so much more to it than that. So I certainly encourage the listeners to keep thinking about it, reflecting on it, and use it as an opportunity to change not only your lives, but humanity.
Yep.
Any final words on this one, Mark?
I don't think so. It's entirely possible that I did print out that diversity message this morning. I have to go look on my printer, but
it's so fascinating, eh? It's so fascinating. And I guess I'll leave you, with one thought that just popped in. And when you are feeling separate, okay, it's as if Shaltazar tapped me on the shoulder. When you are feeling separate, just remember that by connecting to the invisible world, connecting to the source, connecting to that unity that is beyond the human world, that is in the invisible world, they're always there for us. So if you don't feel loved by your spouse or your kids or, your boss or your family, you have the opportunity to tap into the love of source, the divine love that's available to all of us to get us through the storm. So please, just remember that it's always there for you.
Right. Great point.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark, so much for doing this with me. And we'll see everybody again next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care. Love and light to you all.